Joseph, thank you. Sybil, thank you. It's a little early here for me. I mean, not too early. So thank you for that, for being up until 6 or so your time. I was grateful not to have to get up here in California at 5 a.m., but it does mean I'm like solidly off my coffee. So you're going to get a lot of energy from me just as you're sort of winding the day. But I'm really energized because what a treat to be with you. I mean, we're just a few minutes into our time together, and already I've heard some of my favorite words: speculative design, futures, education, trying to use what's available today to change our future. So I don't often get to start my Monday morning with such fabulous fellow travelers, and I really do hope this is a dialogue between us. So please use the chat. We are going to have some time at the end for conversation because we're learning our way forward. And I am very passionate about primary education. This K-12 is what we call it here in the States, from kindergarten through just before university. And if you think of yourself as a futurist, you can't help but look at that population and say, you are our future. You are our future. I mean, literally, like there's a lot we don't know about the future, but one thing we do know is that our children will not be children forever. Our students will, in fact, get older, and they will be and continue to be participants of the society that we all want to be a part of. And so I can't think of a more important group to be spending some time on. And I've really been turning more and more of my attention to this audience, to this group, to this system, because it's really not geared towards the future. I mean, here's a spoiler alert. The future is at odds with our education system. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do at every single level. So I'm going to just share what's on my mind these days, some of the work we're doing at the D School. As I said, it's really meant to be prompts for conversation, and we'll take it from there. So educators, futurists, how do we think of ourselves? How do we think of school really as a vehicle for supporting our future, our next generations? So just quick, I can see all of you. And again, if you want to turn on your camera, that's great. I get it. I've been teaching on Zoom, my Inventing the Future class. And as much as we encourage them to be on camera, they resist. So I get it. But just curious, how many people here took a class on history at some point? I know you all need to, I know you can't graduate unless you haven't taken a class on history, right? Like whether or not it's the right history or history's getting a look, but right. Yeah, thank you for those hands raised. So particularly in your foundational year, I know I'm talking to a group here of experts, but how many people here have taken a class on futures? Like when you look back to your foundational years. I didn't. I mean, maybe Stephen, we're gonna have to talk later. I don't know if that's left over, but we didn't really talk about the future. I mean, we had all kinds of other disciplines, but we never really had a concerted effort to talk about how we might shape the future. And so it was sort of left to others. I mean, maybe you used your imagination in art, maybe you did some creative writing, but it really wasn't a focused effort, at least in my experience. And I'm looking now at schools of all kinds. We don't really have a discipline on futures. And I think from the beginning, right, a lot of times futures is about like challenging essential assumptions. This is an opportunity. Like we could end the talk right now, Sybil, and be like, okay, what are we going to do to create a foundational discipline on futures? And of course, futures, even as a discipline at all, sits in many different places. In some areas in higher ed, it's with the political science. In some, it's within design. In some, it's within humanities. So there's a lot to really uncover about like, how do we normalize this as a set of practices that are teachable and learnable? And that's really the focus of the bulk of my work. As Joseph mentioned, I spend most of my time at the Stanford Institute of Design, the Hasse-Plattner Institute of Design. It looks like this when we're not in a pandemic, filled with people. We have a lot of vertical walls and things on wheels, and we use a lot of Post-it notes to really learn by doing, to really apply our thinking and our practices of design and futures towards problems. I'm currently teaching a class called Inventing the Future. And we, among other things, are constructing 50-year utopia and dystopia debates on emerging tech, not to be experts on it, but to feel our way towards the implications ahead of time. So really, really fun, and would love for you all to come visit me here when we start traveling again. I also, in the last year, because of sort of seeing the enormous gap between where I thought K-12 education needed to go and really the opportunity of the abrupt disruption that we had with COVID. I mean, I don't know, certainly in my lifetime, anything more radical than the immediate shutdown of physical schools and having to reinvent how we reach students online. Such a, in some ways an innovation, it's a gift if you have such an extreme constraint like that. And I partnered with colleagues of mine at the National Association of Independent Schools that serves independent schools globally. And we decided to start a conversation about the purpose of schools. So invite you to take a look at any one of these really intriguing conversations about how to think about bringing citizening to schools, for example, or Roman Krasnarek, who talks about being a good ancestor, right? How do we think about that? So that's been a really rewarding learning journey for me to try to apply some of the futures work to systems that are very slow to move. And finally, I'm spending a lot of time in Civic Futures. So you may have noticed democracy is hitting some challenges lately, particularly where I am in the States. And so I'm spending a lot of time trying to ignite agency in young people about how they feel their confidence and their understanding of how they can make a difference civically when so much of the messaging is alienating and polarizing. So happy to talk about any of these projects in more detail when we open up, but I just want to give you a sense of where I'm spending my time. And Joseph, I think, said it best. I mean, for me, it's really about applied futures. I love thinking about the theory. I've been doing futures work for almost 20 years, starting with scenario planning work at a firm called Global Business Network that is now part of Deloitte in many ways, and they're running a lot of their scenario work there. But I'm really excited about how does this show up? Like, what is the intersection between how it plays out in our everyday, not just the theory behind it, not just the white paper, how do we start to challenge ourselves to think about what is inevitable or not and apply that in every way? How do we cultivate empathy for the future, right? There are no facts about the future, but how we feel about it is pretty strong. And there's some data there that we can mine. Who shapes our future? What are questions around equity that are very much on people's minds? Try to bring them into our classroom experiences and programs. We can't practice things we haven't mastered. Last 2 years have required many of us to be experts at things we've never had a chance to develop. So I'm trying to spend more time unleashing creative agency and impact in a complex world. And it sounds like, that is exactly what your chapter is trying to do in this global effort. So it's so exciting to be a part of it. I want to share a little bit about what we've been doing at the D School and then apply that towards the K-12 or towards futures, both for K-12 or education as well as other problems. A few years ago, we really shifted from teaching what I would say is the hexagons of the design process. Maybe you've seen them over the course, that when David Kelly started the D School about 15 years ago, he didn't really invent design thinking, but he helped make it more accessible by putting a process around it, right? First you immerse, then you empathize, then you define. And we really found that was helpful to help people see that there was a different way of approaching problems than just a linear approach. But we also found that there were people that kind of got stuck on that process and missed that there was a bigger set of practices that really were the foundation for what design is. So I want to share our 8 practices that these abilities that we've been embedding across all of our work. So this meta one that probably many of you are very familiar with, but again, we're woefully underprepared and under practice, which is navigating ambiguity. Like, I'm always amazed at how few people actually take proactive, productive classes on ambiguity. I think the closest we get in any sort of socialized or normalized form is gaming or improv or sports, but we don't really teach them in the context of problem solving that, yes, it's actually really scary when you don't know the answer, right? There is a lot of ambiguity. And certainly a VUCA world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity is filled with incomplete answers. So the ability to learn from others, people and context, the ability to experiment rapidly, to put a new idea out there and try to gain data and improve upon it quickly. The ability to synthesize information, I mean, particularly when it's flooding you. What kinds of information? Are they signals? Are they noise? How do we gather? What is our pipeline of information? Are we in an echo chamber? Are we intentionally exposing ourselves to different kinds of information? And these other 4 abilities, building and crafting intentionally. I mean, my gosh, now we're building in DNA, and we're crafting in the metaverse. I mean, how are we bringing these things? What are our prototyping materials? Very different than pipe cleaners and Post-it notes that we were relying on 10 years ago. The ability to communicate deliberately. Are we speaking in and connecting in TikTok, or are we creating full worlds for us to immerse in, right? We have a lot of different choices about how we are connecting with people. The ability to move between concrete and abstract. Oftentimes when you are talking about the future, it can be very sort of ethereal, very hard to wrap your brain around. So how do we have a fluency between a bigger idea and then putting some tangibility around it? And finally, designing your design work. And this one, again, is a little meta, but what we're learning about neuroscience around the conditions of doing our most creative work. I mean, even if you think about, I don't know what schools are like in Europe, but still so many schools are like, here's your desk, this industrial model of kind of rows of desks where people are heads down doing their work, versus a more open-ended space, or a space that promotes collaboration, or a space that is connected to nature or has windows, can have so much to do with our own biochemistry about being more imaginative and being more open. So I think this is a huge inflection point. I share this passion. We have a whole lab at the D School dedicated to K-12. And we're talking a lot about moving from the mindset of preparing young people for the future. You hear that a lot. We're trying to prepare them for the future. But what if you're preparing them for something that is dramatically different when they get there, right? And we can see evidence of that. See McKinsey saying, whatever the number is of the moment, 80% of the jobs won't exist in 10 years, 50% of the companies won't exist. I mean, whatever it is, we know it's not going to be what it is now. So we have to instead shift our mindset to saying these foundational years in education are not about future proofing. They're really about giving them the agency to shape their future, to feel like they are active players in their future. And that's very different when we think about what kinds of skills we want them to learn. And so we're spending a lot of time helping school leaders think about preparing for uncertain times. So how do we lead in this? And then how does that cascade down to actual classroom experiences? Turns out, now it's so, Joseph, I don't know if you've seen this. I was so tickled to see this, a relatively new study on futures thinking as a leadership skill. This comes from Better Up, which is a behavioral science research consulting firm out here. And this was just published a couple weeks ago. I love this, like classic, right? Classic, catchy headline. Research finds that people with this mindset are surprisingly more successful and less stressed. And you know what that mindset is? Prospection. That's the mindset, the ability to think about the future. So I think this is promising about where some of the research is going for those of us in the futures field. We know this makes you more resilient, more innovative, not just for the tiger team moment when you have to do scenarios, but every single day. And so super encouraged to see this research that talks about leaders who balance optimistic action with thoughtful pragmatism, that they are less stressed than their peers, that they are more productive in the kinds of teams that they lead. And I think that this is really promising for those of us that have struggled to find a partner within organizations that want to go with us on these futures journey, that this kind of burgeoning research can be our friend. And I say that too in K-12, because if we go back to what I said, and that we have to add some new kinds of disciplines and practices, that probably means we need to take some stuff out, which is very, very hard for people to do. So when you have this kind of research that says, look, we know, for example, that there is a massive mental health crisis right now with our young people because of all the pressures that they've been experiencing, isolation, COVID, social media, pressure around advancing and performing. So I could go into a head of school and be like, I really think you should teach prospection. Or I could say, I think there's a way to help our students be less stressed. Right? So how do we become translators to find the value proposition to get people to join us in this journey? And by the way, it's not obvious where this work should show up. So again, there are some schools in the US, and I don't know if the same is in Europe, that have something called advisory or social emotional learning. So do we bring it there? Do we try to bring it in humanities? Do we thread it across all disciplines, that every science, every math, every government should have a futures component? We don't know the answer to this. And again, this is where I welcome your input too. I'm just eager to get it in there in some capacity. So in some ways I'm not picky, but I do want it to start to be established in some ways. All right, I'm going to talk about 3 areas of practices that I have been focused on, at least in my teaching and learning, and trying to flex that abstract to concrete, right? How do we really make this more digestible for more people? And the first is really talking about prospection as the ability to see the future, or really futures. It's really, of course, disingenuous to say the future, right? Futures. And this is really around flexing bold imagination and dreaming in a multiplicity of ways, right? Not just discounting it or putting it in arts or theater, but really saying, no, this is actually critical for us to be able to see and dream and also imagine with our mind's eye, and hold multiple possibilities at the same time. I mean, we know, right? Our brains are wired to see tomorrow as some version of today, right? We like to be anchored in what we know. That serves us well. Thanks to our lizard brain, is the tiger going to eat us around the corner? We want to know, was it there yesterday? We're really not as good at visiting a multiplicity of futures, right? We don't have that as part of our discipline to say, well, how prepared are we today for that? And we see this play out. If you start to pay attention to the language, and again, what's happening in our political system dominates the news, and you'll often hear these politicians say, it was just unthinkable what happened. We just couldn't have imagined what happened. And when you hear that, you have to ask yourself to say, why didn't you think about it? Like, did you have someone responsible on your team to think about the unthinkable? And I get, we can't exhaust, but at least we should stop being quite as surprised as we are, right? I think some of that is in our control, but it requires practice. I was really heartened, and I actually just published a review on it just today, and I can share that with you, Sybil, to share with the group. In December, I went to go see the Smithsonian, which is one of the largest museum complexes in the world in Washington, D.C., and they just launched a futures exhibit. And I think if you're a futurist, this is an important signal to pay attention to, that one of the largest museum institutions dedicated 2 years of their time to put this exhibit together. And they put a lot of it online, of course, knowing that not everybody would be able to get to DC, particularly now. And I really loved how they emphasized the plural, right? Futures, you see it, that S in neon, not one future, not a single future, not an official future, futures. And they've divided up the exhibit in these speculative halls, futures that work. So really talking about how technology might make agriculture more sustainable to feed 9 billion people. They have a whole hall on futures that unite. So how do we democratize access to powerful tools to support communities of problem solvers, starting again with our youngest citizen scientists? And how do we inspire futures that inspire? So how do we use dreaming and imagination and play to really flex our capacity in new ways? So really, I was so excited to see this and was pleased by their choices. At the D School, we're starting to focus on building contextual intelligence and sense making, and sort of really, figuring out like, how do we practice this over time? So I mentioned I'm teaching Inventing the Future Now. We always bring in surprise articles that have popped up just to kind of open up the peripheral vision of people's minds and things that they wouldn't have necessarily picked up on, but to try to build connections to how these early signals might play out, just to change their behaviors and their patterns of how they're taking in information, not just getting to the right answer, but being open to a wide range of possibilities. We're really focusing on empathy for the future. So early on in the pandemic, we probably, like many, did a scenario planning exercise, but it wasn't just how might the world change and why. It was, well, who would need what in this world, right? What would the students need in this world? What would the community need in this world? What would instructors and staff need in this world? To try to get at robust empathy and choices we can make now versus just some of the strategic choices. And, one of the outputs of this exercise, just as an example, is we literally called every single student shortly after the pandemic. We literally did the old-fashioned outreach, checking in on them, because regardless if the pandemic was going to be short or long, we knew that this disruption caused trauma for so many. And so we wanted to ensure that they felt supported from us. We're doing a lot more in bold imagination and storytelling. So for the last year, I've been collaborating very closely with dear friends, Dr. Monty Brooks, who is a scholar in Afro Futures, and Ahmed Best, who is a performer and educator and has a podcast called The Afro Futurist. And together they created an incredible game called Afro Rhythms from the Future, which is really a world building game. Inspired by my dear friend Stuart Candy's work on The Thing from the Future, which is really just getting us to imagine different futures very quickly, to break out of the official future. And it's just incredible what happens in this very, very fun game that is very profound. So we did a workshop with a number of writing teachers from the National Writing Project over the summer to learn how could we blend in poetry of the future and short stories from the future and building artifacts from the future. And here's just an example of some of the outcomes of the game, where one of my colleagues created the mycelium, the air mycelia from Air Jordan. And this idea, she's like obsessed with this idea that education and education systems should really be modeled off of these beautiful mushrooms that are self-generating and nourish each other and are robust and resilient. And so she had this idea for the air mycelia that as you walked, right, you could sort of feel the roots under you, and you can build in a strength from ancestral intelligence. And, again, just like fabulous to think of, right? Like we can't bring things to life we haven't dreamed of. So really extraordinary. So that's just some methods of thinking about seeing in multiplicities, right? Really flexing bold imagination. We're also got a strong bent on shaping the future, particularly around equity and justice, and how do we think about inclusive, sustainable futures? What's within our power now? And here I really think about Roman's work a lot around asking us if we are being good ancestors. And certainly when I think about young people that are shaping better futures, of course, I think about Greta Thunberg and all that she has done to raise awareness from a young leader's perspective about the implications of choices that others are making. Here, I'm just going to highlight a little bit some of our work around emerging tech and how we can make that more available. And the first thing to do is to really expand the idea of what design work is. And of course, you all live this every day, and I'm sure it'll be fun to share some stories and cocktails about, people that meet us and say, oh, you're a designer, do you like this font or that font? This color or that color? And we have to pause and say, no, that's not what we mean by design. So we spend a lot of time helping people understand that, of course, design, yes, means products in the digital and physical form, and the rise of UX and UI has helped, understand the strategic value of that. But increasingly, these products really enable experiences. So my phone here is not really a phone. It's really a gateway to so many things that I can do on that phone that are getting more powerful because the underlying technologies, cloud and AI that are empowering them, that are getting stronger because of the data that's available, that require systems around them to connect, that ultimately have societal implications. And again, if you're a futurist and you see a few months ago that there's a whistleblower from Instagram talking about how toxic social media is to our children, particularly young women, if you're thinking like this, you're like, is this a surprise? Why is this a surprise? Of course, that is it. But if we think about it from the standpoint of, can we build it? That's a very different stance than should we build it? And how do we get ahead of the implications of should we build it? And so we really need to integrate this into our work before we build it, not to mention we need to open up the pipeline of who is building it. So we're spending a lot of time trying to make the foundations of these emerging technologies more accessible to younger people. So for example, my colleague Carissa Carter created this amazing tool called I Love Algorithms. And you can see already, it's like, I love algorithms. And it's sort of like when people say AI, most people, particularly, young folks that have not had a chance to really understand it, it's just like glaze over this opaque, that AI thing. Well, what if we broke it down? What if we made the foundational algorithm super understandable by adding pictures and simple descriptions and examples of what they are, right? Regression learning, reinforcement learning, dimensionality reduction. You know, if you like a hot dog, you're going to like a sausage. That's called clustering. So really bring it down to their language and bringing it to students. So this is a picture of Carissa, who's teaching algorithms to 10-year-olds through 17-year-olds in middle and high school, and all-girls school. And next thing you know, they are solving problems using algorithms and using situations that are relevant to them. So what would it take to actually design the best amusement park experience ever using algorithms that you're now familiar with and data sets, and really asking them to consider what they're leaving out when they only go for certain data sets, and what would be fabulous about it and what would be terrifying about it. That's critical thinking in action. That's computational thinking in action. That's speculative fiction and futuring in action. And I think this is the kind of work that's ahead of us, is to make it so easy to apply this, right? In some ways, we're using our design chops to really invite people to do this kind of work. And that is can be found online. We're about to launch such an exciting new initiative called Rep Magazine. For those of you that might have had the old highlights or Games Magazine, the physical form that you would rip up. So Rep is going to be focused on, again, emerging technologies and fun ways to younger students, and really talking about, for example, voice bots. Like, that's our first edition coming out soon. Who designs voice bots? What is a voice bot? What happens if they don't represent all of us? What are the dangers? Where do they show up? So really just trying to create that sense of understanding and agency and connection to what these technologies are. We have forthcoming editions on blockchain. We have one coming up on synthetic biology, where the students will get to design a cow. So, not talking gobbledygook. I mean, is that a technical term? Jargon, right? But really from the beginning, meeting them where they are. So super exciting. I mean, we fundamentally believe that the future needs to be shaped by all of us, right? And it needs all of us to be stewards of these emerging tech. We have a long way to go on that. We've got a long way to go, and you can even see that a few years ago, a lot of these big tech companies were like, find me an AI ethicist. Right? That is not the way, right? We have to bake it into the conversation from the very beginning. Last one I'll share is this notion of sharing futures, right? How do we communicate futures in different ways? How do we create narratives that people can see themselves a part of? One of my favorite examples, you may have seen this, comes from Meredith Hutchinson in a project called Vision Not Victim, where she'd go into impoverished areas like refugee camps, and she'd work with these young girls and do a visioning project. But instead of coming out with like, when I grow up, I want to be a doctor, she would take these gorgeous pictures of them as doctors, as their future self, in these power poses. And they would have these narratives, right? I am a doctor, and I became a doctor because of what I saw. And this is what my family did to support me. And this is what it took, like backcasting, really using these vivid photographs, and it would just change the kinds of conversations that they would have with their communities and families. Just a totally transformational moment. I mentioned in my class, we have these debates from the future. So this is a dystopian group talking about the dangers of mining asteroids and having one set on a collision course to Earth and what they were going to do. And what I love about these debates is that it's not about wrestling the idea to the ground and convincing the other team that they're wrong. We ask them at the end of this to say, what did you learn from the other team? What surprised you about what they saw differently than what you saw? And we have an expert in the technology there to comment on the state of the industry. And so it's just this fabulous generative opportunity where students are learning about jobs of the future. Our guests are learning about what's on students' mind and what they care about. And it's really just this incredible flywheel effect of everyone feeling much more prepared for how this might unfold. So this is where I'm spending my time. I'm excited, and there's just so much room to bring this into K-12. I mean, I think, when I get lost, as all of us do, in the exhaustion of this moment, I just return to the calling, right? That there are no facts about the future, but we can own our posture and sense of agency around that. And we can model that to our young people. We can invest in processes to understand and interrogate it starting young. We can imagine and dream new possibilities. We can build a set of practices and tools to shape it. We can build empathy and feel those futures, even if, for example, generations aren't available today or not able to express how they feel. We can, in fact, try that on, that they're available for us today. So I feel an increased sense of urgency to be focused on this work. I think it's one of the most important things that we can do for our future, and really excited to be on this journey with all of you to be building it out. I've seen evidence that we can, in fact, move perspectives and mindsets. This is just some feedback we always ask after our classes. I used to think, and now I think. I used to think I have no say in the future I will live, and now I think I have the necessary tools to shape it. I mean, you know, when you're in an education environment, you get that, you're like, I'm done. This is it. Drop the mic, right? I used to think imagining the future was a gene intrinsic to people like talent. And now I think there are many valuable tools. So I keep thinking, like, what if we get this kind of mindset into schools? Like, what if kindergartens say that, and fifth graders, more importantly, and middle schoolers, right? Like, imagine the kind of world we would be living in. So that's the stuff that really excites me. As I mentioned, I'm so thrilled to be working with my K-12 lab. I think we're going to be going to South by Southwest next month and doing a museum of the future and sharing some of these. So we're really working hard and would love to have you as partners on this journey.